Thanks everyone for joining me today for our regular series for at Mosh donors, talking to newsmakers and journalists about the news. Given the headlines of the last week, this was a no-brainer, and we're extremely lucky to have Michael Morell, someone who may know more about Afghanistan and al-Qaeda than anyone else in the world. The only question today is how much can he actually share with us based on what is still classified? First, I want to thank everyone for your support for this account and what we're trying to do to elevate and curate verified, reliable news from all perspectives. Your support will help us expand beyond Instagram to a podcast and newsletter this fall. With that, I'll introduce Michael Morell, who I'm honored to be speaking with today. We worked together at CBS News for a number of years, where he is still national security and intelligence on-air contributor. And for a couple of years, he has now been hosting the Intelligence Matters podcast. I urge all of you to download the podcast on all things intelligence, national security. His latest episodes focus in on remembering 9/11 with a number of guests, high-level guests he was in the room with as those events unfolded. So check out his Intelligence Matters podcast. During his 33-year career at CIA, Michael served as deputy director for over 3 years, a job in which he managed the agency's day-to-day operations, represented the agency at the White House and Congress, and maintained its relationships with intelligence services and foreign leaders around the world. He also served twice as acting director in 2011 and then from 2012 to 2013. His senior assignments at CIA also included serving 2 years as the director of intelligence, the agency's top analyst, and for 2 years as executive director, the CIA's top administrator, managing a whole bunch of the operation. Notable, and we'll get into this a bit, is Michael was the only person who was with both President Bush on 9/11 and President Obama on May 1st, 2011, when bin Laden was brought to justice. Michael was President Bush's daily intelligence briefer on 9/11 and spent the entire day with the president. And when asked by Bush on that day who was responsible, Morell said, "I have no doubt the trail will lead to bin Laden and al-Qaeda." Michael, I'll tell you, I've gotten more than 700 questions. I've tried to group them, summarize them, close to 1,000. They're still coming in. Everyone who's on, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Please ask your questions, and we'll try our best to get to as many as possible. But I'm honored to have you here. Michael, this feels like a full circle moment for you as we speak this week. You were with Bush on 9/11, as we said, Obama when they got bin Laden. How are you assessing, digesting, reacting to the events of this week?
Yeah, so first of all, great to be with you. Great to see you again. I always enjoyed our interactions at CBS. You know, I'd start by saying that this has been a tough few days for me. You know, I have a lot of friends in Afghanistan, Afghans. You know, people I worked with, people I developed personal relationships with. I'm deeply concerned about their future. Some of them have reached out to me. Some of those emails are not easy to read. You know, I got my first email not from an Afghan, but I got my first email related to this issue on Friday afternoon. I got an email from a young journalist who I have a lot of respect for and who I've developed a friendship with. And he was forwarding to me an email that he'd gotten from an Afghan contact of his. And his email to him was from an Afghan intelligence officer who was sitting in the airport in Kandahar. And in this email, he told my friend, "Look, I'm ready to keep fighting, but I'm the only one here. But I'm ready to go. I've been in contact with my friends," you know, with quotes around it, in Kabul, you know what that means. Been in contact with my friends in Kabul, and they tell me there's nothing they can do to help me. So that was the first of many emails that, you know, kind of wrecked my weekend. So if I, you know, come across as more somber today in this interview, you know, it's because this is personal for me. I do think it's very important to separate the decision to leave from the execution in leaving. I support the president's decision to leave. The war was unwinnable. The Taliban fought us to a stalemate when we had 130,000 people in the country. We couldn't win the war for a lot of reasons. But this war was unwinnable. It was highly unpopular here in the United States. I don't believe that we should send young men and young women to fight if the American people don't support it. And I don't believe we should ever ask them to do something that's not possible. So I support the decision to leave. The issue is the way we left and the fact that we did not seem prepared at all for how fast this transpired, for how it transpired, for how many Afghans we potentially will leave behind who wanted to get out, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think it's very important to separate those two issues.
Were you surprised by how quickly, because it seems like overall, everyone's like, at some point the Taliban was taking over again. Is it 6 months? Is it a year? Is it 6 weeks? Is it 6 days? Are you surprised by how quickly this unfolded?
No, not at all. So go flashback to early 2013, and I'm acting director, as you mentioned, for the second time. And we're having a series of discussions with President Obama about how many troops to leave behind, right? What's the force going to be? And I would prep for those meetings, right? So I'd get all my best experts in my office and I'd ask them 1,000 questions. And, I tried to be as prepared as I could for the meeting with the president, obviously. And I remember one of those meetings, I threw out the question to my guys. I said, guys, if we left, how long would it take? And my two most experienced officers on Afghanistan, the two people who had spent more time there than anybody else in CIA, two officers who had both served twice as our chief of station there.
And this is 12 years into the war.
This is 12 years into the war, said 6 months. And ever since that, and I told President Obama that at that meeting. And I've been saying 6 months ever since. And I think, and I have no idea what the intelligence community told President Biden before his decision in April, which is the important, the really important assessment. Mr. President, if you do this, here's what's going to happen. I do think, though, it's important to think about when you give somebody a time frame like that, 3 months, 6 months, a year. One of the most important questions is, when do you start the clock? Does the clock start when the last combat boot leaves the country? Does it start when the first combat boot leaves? I actually think it starts when the announcement is made that we're leaving, because that's when the psychology of everybody on the ground there changes. That's the moment that the Taliban knows that they have won. It's the moment that Afghan security forces know they've lost. It's the moment that Afghan government officials know they got to get the hell out of there. And so, let's say I have no idea, but let's say the intelligence community said 3 to 6 months. Mm-hmm. Let's just assume that for a second. That sounds reasonable to me, that might be the time frame they would have said. If you look at the 2 weeks, right, the last 2 weeks, that 3 to 6 months looks like it was way too long of an assessment, right? But if you go back to April,
when Biden made the announcement that we're leaving by September 1,
then 3 to 6 months is a home run as an assessment, right? And we have to remember that, right, when Biden made the assessment, because of the psychology, it kicked off a whole bunch of things. So number one, it kicked off the preparation of the blitzkrieg that we ultimately saw over the last 10 to 14 days, right? So in April, May, June, the Taliban began encircling provincial capitals, right? That didn't happen in the last 2 weeks, that encirclement. That happened back in April and May and June, right? They were preparing for this.
Did that set off proper alarm bells?
I assume so, right? The intelligence collection is so good in a war zone like that I can't imagine we didn't know about that, right? I was reading about it in the paper. I was reading about it in the media.
Well, I'm going to pause you there just because there's a lot of people who aren't familiar with how the intelligence and policy relationship works. You know, talk to me as in your functions at CIA. How does the process work when it comes to intelligence briefing and the decisions that are made from it? How take me through that line. You're making an assessment in Afghanistan. They're encircling capitals. How does that then get to the White House, and what does the White House do with that?
Yeah. So you know, there would have been an assessment that went into the decision-making process, right? That the president used in making his decision. And then once he made his decision, there would have been daily updates in the president's daily brief telling him what was going on the ground. So I can't imagine that the president's daily brief, right, following his decision wasn't filled with, here's what's going on in Afghanistan. So he would have been told they're encircling provincial capitals, right? Here's what they probably have in mind. Here's why they're doing this, right? The other thing that was happening was that Afghan security forces, which had traditionally seen people desert, right? Those desertions went sky high after April.
Does that surprise you?
Nope, not at all, right? Because they saw the writing on the wall. And are you going to stay and fight and die? Or are you going to go home? Or are you going to join the Taliban, right?
And so, presumably that would be part of your intelligence briefing.
Absolutely.
What's going to happen to the forces?
So he would have been told that, right?
Okay.
He would have also been told the other thing that happened, which is senior Afghan government officials after April started to cut deals with the Taliban to save their own skin, right? We know that President Ghani did that. And when your security forces see your leadership start to do things like that, the will to fight, which is already weak and weak in general, and then made weaker by the president's decision, just evaporates, right? So when the Taliban started their offensive 2 weeks ago, there was no fighting, right? There wasn't any fighting in these capitals.
Right. We were seeing reports that they were taking entire cities with 10 people.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. So I would imagine that all of that stuff would have been reported to the president in the president's daily brief. And while that was being done, the timetable, right, for the possible fall of Kabul would have been updated. And given everything that was happening, I would imagine, again, I don't know, right? I don't read intelligence anymore, but given that, I would imagine that whatever timetable they started with, during the January, February, March decision-making process would have shrunk down.
So when you then sit at the table, or I guess these days on Zoom, and you brief the president on what's going on intel-wise, he takes that input. Then who's giving him his options? What am I doing about it?
So it's a great question, and here's the way it works, right? So imagine sitting in the sit room, and a national security.
The sit room is the Situation Room in the basement of the West Wing.
Yes, yeah. where these classified meetings are held, right? So no phones, and it's sealed, and the whole 9 yards, right? So you're sitting in the sit room. The president's at the head of the table, and the first thing that happens, right, in any meeting is an intelligence briefing. So both the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and the Central Intelligence Agency provide a briefing, and they say, here's our assessment of the situation, Mr. President. Right, here are the things that we think you need to know, right? And they outline that. Then the discussion shifts to policy. So what do we do about this? And that's where you get the Secretary of State laying out options, saying, here's what I think we should do, the Secretary of Defense, other key players. with the intel guys kind of sitting back, because we're not supposed to be involved in policy, we're not supposed to recommend policy, but sitting back and playing what I would call umpire, right? So if somebody starts to drift off too far from the facts, you kind of, jump into the conversation and bring them back to the facts, bring them back to the assessment. But I'll tell you, Moshe, one of the things that happens in these meetings is when the policy guys start to talk, you see that they often have sometimes a bit of a different assessment than the intelligence community, sometimes a significantly different assessment than the rest of the intelligence community. So I was intrigued yesterday when Congressman McCall from Texas, House Homeland Security Committee ranking member, said, look, the intelligence community did a great job here. The Pentagon did a great job here in saying what the likely consequences were going to be. The State Department, on the other hand, had a way too rosy picture of how long this would take. And Zal Khalilzad, right, the US negotiator with the Taliban, was saying, we think the Taliban is going to be willing to negotiate. We think the Taliban is going to be willing to serve as part of an interim government. So it's really important for your listeners to understand that the intelligence community isn't the only entity in government providing the president with a view, right, about what the situation is. So the president's taking all of this in. So when the president says, look, we thought we had more time, is he talking about what the intelligence community told him? Is he talking about what State Department told him? Is he talking about what Zal told him? Is he talking about what the Defense Department told him? Right? Is he talking about the person he just got off the phone with?
Right? We saw an example of this, almost, 18 years ago now, with the lead up to the war in Iraq, where you saw different assessments from different parts of the government. And that was the case actually where Colin Powell in the State Department, is our understanding, and you were there, you can inform me of that, painted a less rosy picture, but also said they probably don't have the WMDs that the other folks are saying they might have, or we believe them to have, right?
Yeah, well, he didn't say that.
Oh. They spun it that way in the aftermath.
So a lot of people claim, right, that they had a different view than the rest of the intelligence community on weapons of mass destruction, and that's just not true. We don't want to go into that right now. There's a lot of spinning of history that happens, right?
There's thousands and thousands of pages of books have been written about this with people's takes on it. But just to say, there's a lot of inputs happening in the situation room. Something struck me that you just said, which is we knew the war was unwinnable. When is there a moment in time during your time working at the CIA where you knew, and how long into the war in Afghanistan did you know that the Taliban were going to have to come to the table with them at some point?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a deep irony here, right? And the deep irony is that there were really two wars in Afghanistan. The first lasted just a few months. The first lasted just until December 2001, January 2002, because by that point, Al-Qaeda operatives had either been killed, captured, or driven into Pakistan. There was no more Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And sometime in 2002, and so we won that war, right? We significantly degraded Al-Qaeda in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And sometime in 2002, the objective changed. The objective changed from, this is the policymaker saying this, we believe that in order to prevent the Taliban from returning, to prevent Al-Qaeda from ever finding a home again in Afghanistan, that we need to change Afghanistan. We need to take what is essentially a feudal society, not a democracy, significant, decentralized government, not a lot of power in the center, not a lot of power in Kabul, and turn it into a liberal democracy with a centralized government. The objective changed. That war we lost. That war we lost. So when did I know that? I knew that after President Obama's surge. When President Obama, yep.
So explain that. Obama comes into office with also the goal of getting out of Afghanistan. And what happens?
He does a review, right? He has a big review done. It took almost a year to do this review. And, you know, I don't think the review came out of where he wanted it, but at the end of the day, he listened to his national security team, right? I mean, there's this young president with no national security experience, and all of these very senior national security guys are telling him, look, we think we can win this war. We just need to do a surge like we did in Iraq. Because that surge was absolutely successul. So,
and the surge meaning Taliban is gone. The Taliban will be destroyed from this surge.
The Taliban will be defeated to the point where they would be willing to negotiate in a significant way, in an honest way, about the future of Afghanistan. And it'll be a future of Afghanistan where individual rights are protected, where there's a democracy and people get to vote for their leaders, where women have rights, where girls can go to school, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I knew, and I don't know what the number was that Obama inherited, but at our peak during the surge, we went to 130,000 troops.
Obama inherited about 50,000.
50,000. And we went to 130,000. And the Taliban fought us to a stalemate.
So explain that for a second. The Taliban's about 60 to 80,000 strong. You know, they're sometimes using 1970s Kalashnikovs, but they have other weaponry. The area of Afghanistan is about the size of Texas. We're the most powerful military in the human history. How do we not defeat them?
The geography of the place. The geography of the place. So there's a great stat, and I wish I had it in front of me. So it is roughly the size of Texas. But if you spread out the total area, right, sides of mountains, right, if you push all the mountains down and spread the place out, it becomes 5-6 times as large. And so it's actually, right, to include the mountains and the sides of the mountains and the valleys and the valley sides, right, it's huge. And you fight valley to valley, right? And we were largely down in the valleys and they were in the hills. And they would shoot down at us every day. You couldn't take territory in a significant way. You couldn't hold territory in a significant way. We held the cities throughout the war, right? But you couldn't take the rural areas from them. And then put on top of that another really important factor, which is the corruption of the Afghan government. You know, if you're going to make a list of corrupt governments around the world, the Afghan government would be, you know, in the top 25%, maybe the top 10%.
And this is a government that we effectively helped build.
Yes, and we're giving money to,
right?
And they're squirreling away, right? So, you know, pay that should go to soldiers, right? It would never quite make its way to the soldiers, right? It would end up in some overseas bank account, right? Sifted off, you know, at some point. I'm sure, I don't want to accuse him of anything, right? But I wouldn't be shocked to know that President Ghani, you know, has a significant overseas bank account or accounts.
I mean, the reporting coming out, including from his former ambassador to one of the Tajikistan or something, says that he took several cars and 169 million in cash.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah.
So and right, under the Taliban, Afghans knew what the rules were. You know, men had to wear a beard of a certain length, or they would be beaten. You know, women had to be covered a certain way, or they would be beaten. You know, women couldn't work, women couldn't go to school. People knew what the rules were, and there wasn't any petty corruption, right? If somebody was stealing, that person was beaten in the square, right? To remind everybody else not to steal, right? And here is the Afghan government being corrupt at every turn. Every time you run into a police officer, they're asking for money, right? And so there's a bit of an affection, right, on the part of the Afghan public for the Taliban. And the other thing, if you're an Afghan and you're sending your kids to school, maybe only your boys, you want them to be safe. And here, security is a real question. But you remember the time of the Taliban when security was pretty good, right? You didn't have to worry about your kids when they went to school. So, put all those together, and there was no winning, right? And we ended up learning what the Soviet Union learned in the 1980s, what the British learned a century ago, right?
Right. The phrase, the graveyard of empires.
Graveyard of empires. Maybe we should have paid attention to that. And so it does raise the question, right? If Michael, if you're saying, we significantly degraded al-Qaeda in by December of 2001, January of 2002, what should we have done? And my answer is, in retrospect, we should have done what the Israelis do. So the Israelis have this phrase called mow the grass. So the Israelis know that they can't change the politics or the society or the extremism of Gaza. Right? They don't try to do that. They just know that every once in a while they have to go in there and they have to degrade Hamas because it slowly has rebuilt its capabilities, right? That's what we should have done. We should have had a mow the grass policy, which is what Biden is now saying we're going to do, right? We're going to watch it. And if we see al-Qaeda come back, we're going to take action. That's the mow the grass strategy. That's what we should have done in 2001, 2002.
So we surge 130,000 troops into Afghanistan. We realize that we still can't eliminate the Taliban. That was 10 years ago.
Right.
What were we still doing there? Why did it take this long to finally get out? And with that sort of a 10-year heads up, why are we seeing the images from Kabul airport that we're seeing?
Yeah. So story.
I know it's a very complicated question. But.
Yeah. I'm trying to figure out how to simplify it, but I'll do that. So, you have the surge and the peak, and we start drawing down, and the Taliban starts making gains, and we have all these meetings with President Obama about what the numbers should be, and it's very clear to me, sitting in the Situation Room, very clear to me that he wants the answer to be zero. Barack Obama wanted out of Afghanistan.
And Vice President Biden, presumably at the time, is at the table as well, correct?
Yeah, but again, it's not easy to be president. You got a lot of people, a lot of very senior people, right, who are making strong arguments for why we should stay, why we should keep 15,000 troops, for counterterrorism purposes, to train the Afghans. We'll get out of combat, Mr. President. We won't be involved directly in combat, but we'll train and we'll conduct counterterrorism operations. So that's what happened for the rest of Obama's presidency. And then, President Trump comes to office and he has exactly the same view as President Obama, which is, I want to get the hell out of here, right? And during this period of time, the Taliban are making gains. And, I don't know when it started, but CIA did 2 annual products on Afghanistan. I mean, we did a lot of work on Afghanistan, but 2 of the things we did, every year we would do this thing called the district assessments, where we would look at every single district in Afghanistan and say, does the Taliban control this? Does the Afghan government control this? Or is it being contested? And every year when it came out, it was more red and less blue. And my understanding is that trend of more red and less blue continued through the Obama administration that I didn't serve in, and all the way through the Trump administration. The other thing we did is an annual assessment on the Afghan security forces and their capabilities. And those were always pessimistic. They never had the number of troops that we were paying for. People would go home, they'd come back, they'd go home, sometimes not come back. Many of them weren't being paid. They just not were what they were being sold as in Washington. And we did those every year, right? And they became grimmer and grimmer and grimmer. And by the way, we got a lot of pushback. We got a lot of pushback from other parts of our government who wanted to say the situation was better than we thought it was.
The picture, we're paying a lot of money. The picture's got to be rosier.
And it's my job, right, as the commander of forces in Afghanistan, it's my job, to have this be a success. So who the hell are you, CIA, to say, we're struggling here, right?
Yeah.
We know we're on the ground. And my pushback was, well, so are we, right? We're on the ground too. So absolutely, right. Obama wanted out, couldn't do it. Trump wanted out, couldn't do it. And then Zal Khalilzad steps forward and says, I think the Taliban is ready to make an agreement. And boy, that's music to Donald Trump's ears, right? Make a peace agreement. And so, as you know, there was an agreement between the United States and the Taliban. It was not a peace agreement. It was a withdrawal agreement. Mm-hmm. It was, we, the United States of America, will, and at that point we had 10 to 15,000 troops on the ground. That agreement said we will leave by May 1st, 2021. And in return, you will not attack us as we leave. Because as the force structure gets smaller and smaller and smaller, right, it becomes more vulnerable and more vulnerable and more vulnerable. So we were concerned about the security of our forces as we were drawing them down. Mm-hmm. And so the Taliban said, we're not going to attack you. That was essentially the deal. There was a piece on extremists and attacking the homeland, which we can come back to later. But that was the deal that Joe Biden inherited. And before Biden took office and before Trump left office, the Department of Defense had drawn down from that 10 to 15,000, whatever the number was, down to 2,500. And the drawdown was not, in my view, I'm sure my Defense Department colleagues would debate me on this, but in my view, it wasn't done in the most secure of manners. We were spread too thin. That 2,500 number is small to begin with, mm-hmm. and it was spread pretty thin. So we were vulnerable. So here's Joe Biden, he comes to office. Already in his heart, right, he believes we shouldn't be there. In fact, he never believed that we should, try to change Afghanistan, right? He was always just for counterterrorism. So for 20 years, he's believed, that we should take a different approach. He campaigns on getting out. It's one of the few things that Trump and Biden agreed upon, right, during the campaign. And so he comes to office and he's got 2,500 troops and he asked for a review. And one of the things that I'm scratching my head over is, why did it take from January 20th to mid-April for that review to get done, right? When he knew what he wanted to do to begin with, right? So that could have been speedier, I think. But here's the situation the president found himself in. His choice was not to keep 2,500 troops or leave. His choice was to leave or plus back up to 10 to 15,000 because those 2,500 couldn't have protected themselves. And if he had announced that we were staying, in other words, if he had announced that he was reneging on President Trump's deal, the Taliban would have attacked us. They would have hit us really hard. And the way we were structured around the country would have meant, I believe, there would have been a series of Benghazis.
So you buy when he spoke earlier this week, that he didn't have a choice, that he couldn't renege, he just could push back. The question is, could he have pushed this back further? Could he have pushed it back to the winter to give us more time to get out our allies? And separately, would you have been an advocate for keeping a base there like we have in South Korea, Japan, Germany for longer term?
So no, because the Taliban wouldn't have allowed it.
Okay.
The Taliban would have repeatedly attacked it until there were enough dead Americans that we had no choice but to come home. So I support the decision to end the war. I support the withdrawal of American forces from Afghanistan. I think the president made the right decision. The issue is the execution of that decision, right? So the day he made the decision, right, his national security team, and this is something that would have, Moshe, this is something that would have fallen on what we called the deputies, right? So the National Security Council is kind of divided into three pieces or four pieces. You know, one is president at the table with his cabinet secretaries. That's the National Security Council. The Principals Committee is the National Security Advisor chairing the meeting with the cabinet secretaries. The third level, which is where the vast majority of the work gets done, is the Deputy National Security Advisor chairs it, and deputies, right, the number twos in all of the national security agencies are around the table. And then the fourth piece is the staff, right, that supports all of that. Well, as I said, the real work gets done by the deputies. So what should have happened the day after the president made his announcement is there should have been a rigorous, systematic, speedy process for how are we going to implement the president's decision in a way that best serves U.S. national security interests. And that's what I think didn't work right. You know, so tremendous amount of criticism, right, of President Obama and over too much process, right? Mm-hmm. And tremendous amount of criticism of President Trump for too little process or no process, right?
Right. Policy by tweet.
Yeah. And in this case, you know, I think there wasn't enough process. I don't know what happened, but that's my sense, right? Is that it wasn't coordinated. So the military abandons Bagram Air Force Base. My understanding is that not everybody in the US government knew that was coming. How does that happen? Right? I would have told you the one piece of territory we shouldn't give up is Bagram. That's the last place we should have been.
Not to have to depend on the civilian airport.
Exactly.
Kabul, but have our own air base that we built.
Right. That we can secure.
And we can secure.
That's far from Kabul. Not far, but it's, you know, it's not downtown Kabul, right? Or on the outskirts of Kabul. And that we can control access to, and we can bring the people there who we want to get out, right? All the Americans and those Afghans who worked most closely with us and who are at greatest risk from the Taliban.
I want to get to a couple of questions. The most significant of which, most popular of which is, what is the threat right now to the American homeland from the Taliban? A lot of folks are curious about the Taliban-Al-Qaeda relationship. Yeah. So what is the threat? Should I be worried today now about a terrorist attack on US soil with the Taliban back in control of Afghanistan? And what is the Taliban ambition as far as threats to the US homeland? Yep. And what is the state of Al-Qaeda? And I know this is a lot of questions, but just kind of lay that out, the overall terror threat today, given Taliban control.
Yeah. So the Taliban itself is not a threat to the United States or to our interests outside of Afghanistan. They've never shown any interest in conducting terrorist attacks outside of Afghanistan. The issue is their relationship with Al-Qaeda. Now let's go back to that Trump deal with the Taliban. As part of that deal, they agreed not to allow groups to have safe haven in Afghanistan who threaten the United States. The trick is they don't believe that Al-Qaeda did 9/11. The trick is they don't believe that Al-Qaeda is a threat. At least this is what they say, right? I don't know what they really believe, is what they say. And so in their mind, the agreement does not say they can't have a relationship with Al-Qaeda. They can't have Al-Qaeda, you know, as their neighbors. In In fact, people talk about, how long will it take al-Qaeda to come back to Afghanistan? They're already there. They fought side by side with the Taliban for the last 20 years. They've spilled blood together. They have intermarried with the Taliban. So there are now grandchildren, maybe even great-grandchildren, right, of these intermarriages between Afghans and Arabs. And so al-Qaeda will be welcomed by the Taliban in Afghanistan, I guarantee you. Just as I would have guaranteed you 6 months ago that the Taliban would take over Afghanistan if we left.
But
Same
over
guarantee.
20 years, we couldn't, why, again, is it the mountainous terrain, is et cetera, post bin Laden, post taking out their leadership, a 20-year war on terrorism, what's left of al-Qaeda?
So when they left al-Qaeda at the end of 2001, they went to Pakistan. First place they went was the settled areas of Pakistan. The Pakistanis made a very significant decision by President Musharraf to work with us against al-Qaeda. And so the United States and the Pakistanis started capturing a bunch of these guys who were in the settled areas of Pakistan, in Pakistani cities. And that drove al-Qaeda into what's called the Fatah, right? The tribal areas between kind of this ungoverned spaces, right? Between Pakistan and Afghanistan, where it was really tough to get at them, to collect intelligence and then to take military action against them. And there they started to rebuild. And so there was at that point, right, through most of the 2000s, into the early 2010s, through my entire time at CIA, they were in Pakistan, they weren't in Afghanistan. I remember President Obama used to say, and I heard him say this numerous times, why are we in Afghanistan when al-Qaeda is in Pakistan? But slowly over time, as the Taliban gained more and more strength, and as we drew down troops in Afghanistan, al-Qaeda started coming back. And so I think what's going to happen now is you've got a kind of a new generation of al-Qaeda guys in Afghanistan who will be welcome to stay. There will be al-Qaeda guys from other parts of the world who will want to come to Afghanistan and kind of join the victory celebration. And there are some pretty senior al-Qaeda guys who have been in Iran for years. Question is, what's going to happen to them? Are they going to be allowed by the Iranians to leave and go back to Afghanistan? I hope we're talking to the Iranians right now about don't you dare do that.
Do the Iranians listen to that sort of?
So it's interesting. The Iranians have had a kind of a hold the tiger by the tail relationship with al-Qaeda for years. So they don't want to arrest these guys and throw them in jail because they don't want to become a target of al-Qaeda. But they also don't want to let them go. And if they conduct a terrorist attack against the United States, once they let them go, that we would blame Iran. So they've been in this, we don't know what to do with these guys. So they've been under house arrest. Many of them have escaped Iran, gone back to Pakistan, gone back to Afghanistan, but there's still some pretty senior guys there that would make a difference. So they're going to reconstitute. Al-Qaeda is going to reconstitute. I believe that strongly. If you listen to some of the testimony by senior administration officials the last couple of months, they've put the reconstitution at 2 to 3 years. I'd say it's going to happen much faster if we allow it. I'll come back to that in a second. So if we allow it, I think it'll be 9 to 12 months before they've got a significant overseas attack capability again.
So 9 to 12 months to have the same capability they had to pull off 9/11 style attack.
Now it'd be harder, right? Because our defenses have gone up significantly after 9/11, right? It's not as easy to do anything that they did in pre 9/11 period. It's much harder, but they will develop an attack capability unless we do two things. Unless we, and this is what the president was talking about the other day, and My only question is whether we have the focus and will to do what the president said. So the two things we need to do to make sure that we don't get attacked again is we have to be able to collect intelligence on al-Qaeda. But we're not going to have a presence there anymore. So it's not easy to collect intelligence in a country where you have no presence. And so the intelligence community is going to have to figure out how to keep an eye on al-Qaeda from outside the country.
We won't be able to have clandestine undercover officers in Afghanistan anymore, or just not at the level?
How would that work? How would that work? We don't have an embassy, right? We're not going to have an embassy. Nobody's going to have diplomatic immunity, right? This isn't Moscow where if you get caught, you get sent home, right? This is you get caught, you're dead. So no, right? There's other ways. There are ways to do this. I'm not going to say what they are, right?
Yeah.
There are ways to do this, but it's difficult.
Yeah.
And it's expensive, and it takes resources, and it requires focus. And so that's one piece, is to be able to keep an eye on them so that you will know when you need to mow the grass, right? When the grass is high enough, you say.
And define mow the grass. We launch a couple drones.
So that's the second piece of this, right? Which is the US military has to figure out, when necessary, how to be able to degrade al-Qaeda, right? And I'm just making this up, I'm not a military guy, multiple B-2 bombers taking out every al-Qaeda training camp, bin Laden types of operations where we send in special forces, right? I don't know what it is, but the Pentagon's got to figure out that piece of it. And then a president, whether President Biden or the next president, has to have the will to do that, right? Why didn't President Clinton degrade al-Qaeda in Afghanistan prior to 9/11? They were suspected of the first World Trade Center bombing, suspected, not confirmed. They had attacked 2 of our embassies in East Africa. They had attacked the USS Cole off the coast of Yemen. They had tried to attack LAX during the millennium and conduct a number of other attacks during the millennium. And the intelligence community was telling the president, these guys have the capability and they want to attack you in the homeland. And President Clinton chose not to take significant action to degrade them. Why not? It's really tough without a predicate to sell the American people on putting US servicemen and US servicewomen at harm's way, right? And so without an attack, it's hard to say we're going to go attack them when they really haven't attacked us, right? Here in the homeland. Part of the Bush strategy, right, post 9/11 is we're not going to wait anymore. Right? We're going to do what the Israelis do. We're going to move before they do. So the third question, right, is you got to watch them. You got to have military capability to do it, and then you have to have the will, right, the political will to do it when the grass gets high enough. So should people be worried about the United States of America being attacked again from Afghanistan? I'm not worried right now. We'll see how focused the US government remains on this problem. We'll see whether what President Biden promised earlier in the week that he would do vis-a-vis Afghanistan going forward happens. But if we don't stay focused on it, we will make ourselves vulnerable again.
And distinguish ISIS from al-Qaeda. Does ISIS also operate there? Is the capability that ISIS has different from, why are you more worried about al-Qaeda reconstituting Afghanistan than we've ever should have been worried about ISIS in Syria and Iraq?
So, fundamental difference between the groups is the guys running ISIS didn't want to be subordinate to the guys running al-Qaeda. Fundamental difference, right? There was a spin-off. There was a spin-off. They wanted to run themselves, right? They didn't want somebody else running. There was also a view of, do you force the United States, do you force the head of the snake out of the Middle East before you form your caliphate, or do you form your caliphate and then force the United States out. So a little bit of a different tactics there, but at the end of the day, it's who's in charge, right? So there was an ISIS group, there is an ISIS group in Afghanistan, but it's been significantly degraded by guess who? The Taliban. And in this case, we actually helped the Taliban degrade ISIS. So we, the United States, I don't know this from, my contacts in the intelligence community. I know this from a terrific young reporter, that the United States was providing intelligence to the Afghan government, which it knew was being passed to the Taliban to go after ISIS. So
they're a competitor of sorts.
They're a competitor. They're absolutely a competitor, right? And so I have no concern about ISIS becoming a problem in Afghanistan because the Taliban won't allow it.
So we had to go in and degrade capability, and it was more difficult for Clinton and Bush initially. 20 years later, technology has progressed, right? Our satellite technology, our drone technology, presumably. To what extent does the technology that's developed over the course of the past generation made it easier for the U.S. to manage the situation, to mow the grass, so to speak, in the same way we do in Yemen, in the same way we do in Syria, in the same way that we can continue to do so in Afghanistan?
Yeah, so it's a good question. And the answer is, to a significant degree, it makes it easier. Makes it easier to mow the grass. But it doesn't make intelligence collection that much easier, right? These people don't understand that these drones that the US government uses are pinholes, right? So you have to know where to look. Right? There has to be some information that takes you to a certain place at a certain time, right? And that's not easy to come by, right? And that's what the intelligence community has to figure out, is how to get that information to tell that technology where to go.
Human, as you guys refer to it, human intelligence.
Yes.
A lot of questions about, is this Biden's fault? Is this Biden's fault? Is this Biden's fault? Is this Trump's fault? Is this getting away from the blame game for a second? How could this have transpired differently to ensure both that we get all the Americans out secure, but that that right now there's a whole bunch, I presume you're talking to them, Afghans who helped us out outside Kabul, even inside Kabul, who have zero hope of being able to use that visa and escape the country. How could we have prevented that situation?
Yeah. So go back to that process that I talked about, right? Had that process, been done immediately in April, in that deputies committee process, right, that I talked about, and we had figured everything out step by step by step by step, right? We're not going to do step 100 until we've done step 1 through 99. That kind of detail, that's what the deputies do, that kind of detail. If we had done that, we would have done a better job of getting people out before the end, right? We wouldn't have given Bagram up. We would have used Bagram as the last staging point, as we talked about earlier, right? And so what would have been different is we would have got more people out. But much more importantly, the image of the United States would be very different, right? The fundamental cost here is the image that the United States can't manage a situation, right? And that the United States was driven out of Afghanistan. That we lost this war, which we did, but the image, right, of from the airport of the last few days, right, paint a picture of the United States that's not pretty. So there's a propaganda problem, right, which the Russians and the Chinese are already all over. So more people out, and not a reputational problem like the one we've created.
And translate that reputational problem for, and that's where I kind of wanted to end here today. The ramifications, translate for us what we've seen transpire at the airport, et cetera, and this botched departure from Afghanistan. How does that impact the U.S. in practical terms, as an American, what does that mean to me, and what does that mean to our allies and relationships abroad?
Yeah, so I think there's two impacts. One that people are talking about and one that they're not. And the one they're talking about is the message this sends our adversaries and the message it sends our allies, right? So that's one. So, the message it sends to the Russians and Chinese is that we're going to run away from a fight. And the message that sends to our allies is that we may not be there for them, right? And so it means that those allies have to hedge a bit more. They were already hedging, right, during the Trump administration because of the way he was treating them. And what does hedge mean? It means you have to have a closer relationship with the Russians and Chinese. You got to take their interests more into account. So that's one, right? That's one set of damages. The other, I think, is internal. So, the part of the problem with our politics, this better than I do. Part of the problem with our politics is that many Americans think their government's inept, think their government can't get it right. Looks at the Iraq War and says, how did that happen? Looks at the 2008 financial crisis. How did that happen? I run into kids on college campuses all the time who think their government's incapable of getting anything right.
And it's actually a question I just got from Mandy Livingston here. How can the American public trust that Washington will take intelligence reports and warnings seriously to prevent future terrorist attacks?
Bingo, right? Bingo. So maybe that's the biggest damage here at the end of the day is this doesn't help our politics at all. It actually makes it worse.
I'd like to hopefully we can end more optimistic.
On that cheery note.
On that cheery note. I guess I guess now that one of the questions I had is, what does the folks in the intelligence community, what does the government generally do after things like this transpire to ensure they don't happen again?
Yeah, what they should do, right? What they should do is they should hot wash this, as they say at the Pentagon, right? Go back and look at what we did and what we didn't do, and do an after action report. And that after action report should be done by an outside group. I don't think Congress is capable of doing it because they're too politicized. And I don't think the people who were involved in it should do it because they're biased. So if I were the president, if I were Jake Sullivan, I would ask a group of outsiders to come in and take a look at the intelligence, take a look at the decision-making process, take a look at the process of figuring out what the execution of the president's orders were, and where we could have done better. And I would share that unredacted, right, with the American people, because transparency is really important here.
And short term, to get out as many, well, first of all, we have an agreement allegedly with the Taliban to let all the Americans through. How do we, in the short term, between now and September 1st, I guess is the deadline, get out as many of the Afghans and Afghan families that we made promises to?
Yeah.
How does that work?
So for the most part, I think the Taliban will let Afghans who want to leave. I know they've killed a couple of folks already. Maybe there were special vendettas, but so first of all, the Taliban has no interest in harming an American, right? The last thing they want to do is give us a reason to stay. What I worry about is maybe a rogue Taliban element, right? That acts.
Well, they also just released 10,000 prisoners from right? Bagram, yeah.
Right. So I worry about a rogue element, but in terms of Afghans, I think they'll let go most who want to go. But the kind of folks that I dealt with, they don't want to leave Afghanistan. They're Afghan patriots. They don't want to leave their country. They want to save their country. So I imagine that, we'll offer to many people the opportunity to leave, and they'll say no. There's already an insurgency beginning against the Taliban.
I saw this in Panjshir with Masood's son.
Yes.
Does that have a real potential to
not without outside support, right? And I'm sure they're going to ask the United States, and I'm sure the answer is going to be no. because we don't want to give the Taliban any reason to, encourage al-Qaeda to attack us, right? So I'm sure the answer will be no. So I think it's going to be really tough for an insurgency of former Afghan officials, right, to do any serious damage to the Taliban.
I was surprised by that answer. You believe that the Taliban is okay with letting Afghans out who help the U.S. government, that they're not planning to execute them as an example.
I think they probably put them in different categories. People who worked for Western news agencies, I don't think they're going to do anything to. People, even some, basic translators for the U.S. military, State Department, they don't have a vendetta against. I think the people they're going to brutally kill are people who worked with the special forces and people who work with CIA.
As far as lessons to our enemies, whether you're Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, we talked a bit about the Russians and the Chinese. What lesson have they learned from this experience? And one additional question I had, given we're supposed to be out of Iraq by the end of the year, does this change that?
Yeah,
or are the two unrelated?
So that's a little, so the Iraq thing's a little bit of a shell game.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of reclassified some of the troops who were doing combat, against, kind of special forces who were with Iraqi security forces fighting ISIS. We've simply reclassified them as trainers. So it's less of a drawdown than it's made out to be. But I hope the message is going to be, let's keep them there a little while longer, because I don't think the Iraqi security forces are any more capable of dealing with ISIS than the Afghan security forces were dealing with the Taliban. So I would hope it would, kind of reinforce the view that we need to stay around there for a while.
Final question for you. What lessons have you personally learned, do you take away from your experience in particular dealing with Afghanistan, and what lessons have we taken away and should the US government take away from this 20-year experience?
Yeah, so, why did we commit that original sin that I talked about, right? And the answer is American hubris. We think we can do anything, right? We think we can change the world in whatever way we want. And we can take a feudal society and turn it into a liberal democracy. We can't do everything. We can't do anything, right? And I think that's the most important lesson. We have to be humble in what we can do and can't do. And we have to be particularly sensitive to that when we're sending into harm's way our nation's sons and daughters.
And you personally?
I look back and say, okay, what could the intelligence community have done better, right? I wasn't in a senior position, so I don't know what we said during the debates about changing the objective in Afghanistan at the end of 2001, 2002. I don't think we said, this is not winnable, Mr. President. We probably didn't say that. We probably should have. My personal lesson about the entire post 9/11 period is that the United States had to do some tough stuff, whether it's in Afghanistan or in other parts of the world. And I think we should have been much more transparent with the American people about that tough stuff. Because at the end of the day, if the American people don't support us, right, then we shouldn't be doing it. It's not consistent with we live in a democracy here, right? I remember President Obama, near the end of my time in government, talking about the US government's drone program and the president wanting it to be much more overt. And I remember his logic was, which I agree with 100%, his logic was, we're going to have to do this in many places around the world for quite some time. And in order to do that, we need the support of the American people. And we need at least, at minimum, the acquiescence of the international community. And the only way you can do that is by talking about it, is by saying, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, here are our successes, here are our failures, here's what we're doing to fix, when we have a failure. So to me, the lesson is, boy, it's too easy to make a lot of this stuff into secret wars. And that's not a healthy thing in a democracy at all.
It's the same. James Stavridis, the admiral who was the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, had a piece in Time magazine actually this week where he named 4 lessons, and that was his 4th lesson, which is preparing the American people, informing the American people, and being transparent with the American people about what's going on.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Michael Morell, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. I appreciate you taking the time to answer these questions. And I wish the best to your friends and former colleagues who are on the ground there as this unfolds. And a reminder to everyone to check out his podcast, Intelligence Matters, which right now is doing a series remembering 9/11. Is there anybody coming up, or any pitch you would like to make for upcoming episodes?
Our first Remembering 9/11 piece was Steve Hadley, then President Bush's Deputy National Security Advisor. Today, we dropped an episode with Andy Card, then the President's Chief of Staff, who, of course, was with the President all day. Next week, we will have Sandy Winnefeld, who rose to be the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, but on 9/11 was the commander of the USS Enterprise. That was steaming home after a deployment and turned around on 9/11 and was part of the first set of strikes against the al-Qaeda folks in Afghanistan. And then we'll finish up with a couple of CIA people and their experiences on 9/11.
Great. Michael, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Good to see you. Take care.
Good to see you too. Talk to you. Bye.